Welcome to the Green Urbanist, podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome back to another episode. Today's episode is a conversation with Laura Barron, who is an architect and head of sustainability at Purcell, who are architects and engineers who specialise in the historic environment. So she operates in a really interesting space between, conservation of built heritage, so listed buildings and very historic structures like cathedrals, but also being a sustainability person and working out how do you make these incredibly old and protected structures actually fit for the 21st century, for low carbon, for fulfilling all the sustainability criteria that we need our buildings to be fulfilling now. So that's exactly what we're talking about. We cover a really wide range, from thinking about individual houses up to actually cathedrals, and Purcell have worked on a number of really iconic structures like cathedrals across the UK, etc. So we're learning about the challenges but also the opportunities at the intersection of sustainability and heritage, and really talking about a couple of ways forward that I think anyone who is interested in historic places or is working on these kind of projects, I think you'll get a lot to take away from this. A lot of wisdom here from Laura. Don't forget to have a look at my Substack blog, where there'll be a companion blog post to this podcast episode, where you'll get to see visuals of the kind of projects we're talking about. The link to that is in the episode description. Enjoy the conversation, and I'll see you next time. Can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Laura Barron. I am Head of Sustainability at Purcell, and Purcell are historic building conservation architects. And we are about 200 people, probably a bit more, and that's a mixture of architects, masterplanners, building surveyors and heritage consultants, all working towards a kind of goal of prolonging the life of our historic fabric and our built heritage. And so we've been really privileged to work on some of the most recognisable buildings in the country and the world, including the British Museum, National Gallery, Palace of Westminster, some really, really amazing buildings.
Yeah, looking through your website, it's almost like looking through a tourist website because there's just all these amazing landmarks.
It's a real honour, actually. And my role really is to sort of direct the sustainability strategy within the practice, both looking at our kind of operational sustainability, but really focusing on projects as well, and trying to make sure that all of our staff are speaking a kind of common language when it comes to these kind of things, and that we're really trying to push forward the sustainability agenda in the historic environment, and really kind of be pioneering in our approach.
Yeah, well, maybe as a first question, what do you think we can learn from historic places about sustainability in general?
It's a really good question, and I know you've done a couple of podcasts where you're kind of really keen to learn from what we've done in the past, and I think that's certainly the approach that I try and take as well. And historic buildings are such a wealth of information and resources, and so I guess the first and most obvious thing is that they were built to last. The ones that are still around us have lasted, and there are many reasons for that, and partly because of the materials that they were used, often stone, timber materials that were have got a good long lifespan. They use locally sourced materials that were readily available, and materials of the earth often. Very simple palettes of materials as well, so it's quite easy to replace certain components and make those kind of adjustments over time, and they have been adapted over time, and that's quite a key thing. A lot of historic buildings, you see examples of it all the time. There's, whether it's a Georgian townhouse in central London that's now an office block, or a warehouse in north of England that's now a block of flats. It's that they've been able to adapt over time, and that's really, really key part of their value. And I think one of the other things that is quite important is that they've lasted for a long time because they bring people joy, and they people love them. If you think of some of our, most visited cities in the UK, you're looking at Bath, York, Oxford, London, obviously, but they've kind of got this historic core at their heart, and that's what draws people there. And people have this kind of very emotive response to our built heritage in a way which is quite hard to sort of quantify.
Absolutely. And that's a really good point. I think the adaptability part and the sort of beauty and the cultural aspect of it, of feeling an attachment to a place and feeling that a building or a neighbourhood is of a place rather than being, it could be anywhere, which is what, unfortunately, a lot of contemporary architecture sometimes is like. Although, as you said, it's difficult to quantify, the places that we've ended up demolishing and rebuilding have been the places that people haven't had that cultural attachment to, where they've said, this isn't working for us, functionally or aesthetically. But you would never demolish a cathedral, even if you're not a religious person.
It has that kind of cultural value that we talk a lot about value in architecture and in built environment, but in a kind of quite a negative way. So, if you think of value engineering as a common term, it actually makes this historic environment, we value it in a different way, and we put protections on it. So we have listed buildings and conservation areas because we see the value that it has to our culture and to as a kind of resource that tells us about our past. And that kind of perception of value, I think, is a really key lesson of how we can think about some of the issues around sustainability, because it's not related to cost. And I think that's a really key thing that we have to try and move away from, is that kind of constant coming back to, well, how much does it cost? Which is obviously important, but there's other important aspects, and heritage value being one of them.
Yeah, I often think, I'd love to go back and just be inside the head of one of those classic architects like Christopher Wren and see, did they really think about their architecture lasting hundreds of years, as it has? And I'm not sure that's something any contemporary architects actually think about.
No, you're right. I think that's a really good point. And I think they did think like that, particularly obviously with the more iconic buildings. But I think even more domestic scale historic buildings, I think the concept of a circular economy seems quite new to us, but actually the principles of it we've been doing for centuries and centuries. I've got a grade 2 listed terraced house at home, and the roof trusses have got various notches from where they've been used in a different setting. Oh, right. So you can see the story of that kind of bit of timber that's now in my house, and at some point, and my house is 400 years old, but before that timber had a life before, and you can see that it did. And so those principles of reusing materials and things, that's not a new concept. And obviously the reasons why that was happening are different. It wasn't necessarily because they wanted to save the planet. It was more because there wasn't the abundance of materials that we have now. And so when there's a scarcity of resources, you kind of do have to keep reusing things and make the most of what you've got. I don't know if you've heard of the term spolia. Is Latin for spoils. I really love this. If you Google it, you get loads and loads of really interesting images from Italy, usually, and Greece. And it's basically the kind of materials that have just essentially been used. So pieces of masonry, sculpture that have just been taken and put into a new building, and you end up with a kind of like patchwork of different bits of material that really clearly show that they're not part of the building, that they weren't made to be part of the building, they're just there, stuck in the wall, and it's really fun. But the circular economy is not a new concept. It's something that we've kind of just rediscovered. Exactly.
Fantastic. I think bringing us back to the present and maybe talking a bit about your work. We're in a really difficult period in the UK and I guess across Europe of energy prices, and suddenly it becoming incredibly expensive for people to heat homes, and I imagine also historic buildings, even more so. Is this something that is now like informing your work?
Definitely, yeah. So I kind of looked into this quite recently. So the UK has got about 500,000 listed buildings, and England alone's got 10,000 conservation areas, and that's giving protection to about 10% of the building stock in England alone. And obviously Wales, Scotland, Ireland have their own as well. But at the same time, the UK has got one of the worst performing building stocks of the whole of Europe. And that is quite clearly tied to the age of the building. And so this is obviously an area that should be addressed, and we shouldn't ignore our old leaky buildings. And it's one of those areas, if we are able to address this and do it kind of in a proper, responsible way, we can reduce energy prices, we can reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, can provide energy security. It really does feel like a bit of a silver bullet if we're able to do this. And if we can do it in the most sensitive of settings, then it's then easy to do in the less sensitive settings. So it's something that we're really seeing clients are becoming more and more concerned about, obviously, and something that we're really trying to address. And I think the challenge is in a historic setting is trying to get the balance right, and the idea that sustainability measures and energy efficiency measures historically have been seen to kind of potentially cause harm to historic fabric. So if you think of PV windows, double glazing windows being installed in place of original timber sash windows, for example, or photovoltaics being installed on a conservation area. So those kind of measures, I think, there's in the past been a bit of a clash of those two worlds. And I think I would argue that the overall goal of building conservation is to preserve and protect our inherited world. And that aspiration is exactly the same as a sustainable approach. And so the two things should work in harmony. And it's all about just finding the right balance and the right way of looking at things. And some planning or local authorities are kind of really pioneering in this. So Royal Borough of Kensington, Chelsea in London recently released a kind of planning order that kind of provides very clear guidance on how you can incorporate photovoltaics onto Grade 2 listed buildings and Grade 2 star, which is really good. But obviously a lot of other planning authorities are still behind the curve on that, and I think that there is a bit of a disconnect there. And so one of the methods that we use a lot is a methodology called constructive conservation, and that is about how it's an approach that helps you manage change in a historic building in a way that doesn't cause harm to the fabric, and it ensures the continued use and enjoyment of that building, and it allows for the kind of adaptation and updates that are needed to secure its future, but weighed in a very specific, measured, considered way. And so it's a methodology that has previously been used a lot for accessibility, if you have to kind of introduce lifts into a building, fire as well, if you need to make upgrades related to health and safety. And so this is an approach that we think can be spread out to encapsulate energy efficiency measures as well. And it's really about kind of trying to do it in a responsible way. And there's a perhaps a tendency for people to think, okay, what I need to do is get some photovoltaics or a heat pump, and that's partly because there's a lot of rhetoric from government that heat pumps are going to solve our problems. And that's great. It is important that we're talking about these things. But actually, if you do just that without looking at the energy performance or what your actual energy wastage is and how you address that, then you're going to end up with a system that is too big, it needs to work hard, it's going to cost you more. And so we're trying to work on the principle that the greenest and probably cheapest energy is the energy you're not using. And so addressing things like, where your energy is just kind of leaking out the building through cracks or gaps, and, it's quite a high proportion in old buildings, how you then sort of eliminate that energy wastage first, then look at how you might improve the fabric and the performance of your fabric, so roof insulation, internal wall insulation. Obviously, not every historic building is going to be suitable for those kind of measures. If you think about Canterbury Cathedral, where we've worked a lot, you're not going to line the internal walls of Canterbury Cathedral with insulation. You're not going to put double glazing instead of the beautiful stained glass windows there. But nor do you necessarily need to in that setting. It's about kind of starting from a position of knowledge and understanding what the issues are, what the work needs to be done, how the building's being used, how it needs to be used, and where there can be kind of efficiencies in how that's kind of functioning. And also thinking of a building as a system and not just thinking about one measure at a time, kind of thinking about how it's all interconnected. It's different. It's a system of interconnected materials and functions and users, and how can they best work in harmony with each other.
As you said, it's when we're talking about historic buildings, it's a wide range of different types of buildings and uses. So if you're talking about a house that someone needs to live their life in, or a cathedral where people are only visiting for maybe an hour a week, the kind of thermal comfort you'd expect from that space must be totally different.
Exactly, yeah. And that's really the starting point, is trying to understand what people's perception of that space. And, if you go, like you say, if you go to the cathedral once a week, or, just for occasionally, you're more likely to wear a few layers. And kind of, because you know that they are cold, drafty places, and people that are visiting those spaces don't mind sitting there for an hour in their coat. And that's just unaccepted. But you don't necessarily want that if you're working in an office. 7 hours a day. So it's really important to try and understand that connection between the users and what their kind of occupation, what the occupants need to make that space function most efficiently.
So maybe we can go to some case studies?
Yeah.
In your work, like, what are some of the challenges you've come across, and what have you sort of solutions you've found?
Yeah, so I mean, given that we've spoken about cathedrals a couple of times, so we do quite a lot of work with the Church of England, and they've set a target to get their buildings to net zero by 2030, which is ambitious, but brilliant. And they see it as part of their role to kind of set that standard, and it's really amazing. And we're working with a couple of cathedrals. We've just finished some work in Newcastle, and that part of it's a step along their journey towards net zero, so it's part of the process. And so they've recently installed a couple of air source heat pumps combined with some underfloor heating, and we think it's the first example of that being done in a Grade 1 listed cathedral. And the underfloor heating involved removing 100 ancient stone ledges and putting the underfloor heating down and relaying the ledges slightly in a different arrangement to allow better accessibility. So it was kind of part of a broader approach that looked at a number of different issues. So it wasn't just the sustainability element, it was looking at accessibility as well. So they're really pleased with the results. I think they're really proud of it up in Newcastle. And we're working with Salford Cathedral as well. They've got big aspirations as well, and looking at various different heat pump solutions and different energy efficiency measures there. So they're really exciting, and they're probably the most, Grade 1 listed cathedrals are going to be quite challenging. It's much easier to look at buildings when they're, we have a heritage at risk register, so buildings that are at risk go on a register. It's in the name, the key's in the name, and so when you've got a building like that, it's usually in quite poor condition, and so suggesting improvements and measures that will help save that building is usually an easier sell. So, for example, we've got in Stoke-on-Trent, there's a Centre for Refurbishment Excellence, CORE, and that is on the site of some an old pottery works, and so there's, I think, a number of brick kilns, which are really iconic in the area, kind of very. It's a very significant building, but obviously it was left to kind of dilapidate for a while, and so the client at the time was really keen to push this idea that we create this centre of refurbishment excellence, which just showcases how you can refurbish a building that is of significance, and showcase a number of different techniques of doing so. So it looks at external wall insulation, internal wall insulation, cavity wall insulation. It's got lots of different measures. It's got air source heat pump, ground source heat pump, biomass boilers. It's got, it literally, they just threw everything at it to test it, and it's providing kind of conference suites and learning spaces and things.
What an interesting thing to do.
It's a really interesting brief.
Building that was at risk.
And another one we're in the process of installing the first double glazing in a Grade 1 listed building in Leadsom Hall, which is which we're very excited about. It maybe doesn't, if you're not in the world of heritage, it doesn't sound that groundbreaking, which is mad, isn't it? But it is, the first instance of it in a Grade 1 listed building is quite pioneering. And it took so much work with Historic England to get the design of these windows right that they were happy with it. And really, that's kind of what we need, is more case studies and examples of saying, this is fine, we can do this, and the building is okay, and that's, that's what we need to do. But we need more examples to be able to point to them and say, it works, we know what we're doing, this is how you can do it, and this is how you can ensure that we secure the heritage significance of the building at the same time of improving energy efficiency.
How much flexibility does, we'll say, a local conservation officer have to say yes or no to these things?
It varies, and that's part of the problem, because a lot of it is quite subjective. And so you will get something in one part of the country that the conservation officer thinks is fine, but something in another part of the country they would say no. And it is very subjective, which is why having those kind of case studies and lessons that you can draw from, even if it's from different regions, like, it just adds ammunition really to the argument. So it is definitely a challenge, is that. And but organisations like Historic England, who are kind of consultee with most of these projects, they are really pioneering some of these. They've got a whole team looking at sustainability, and they are pioneering a lot of these issues and doing a lot of research. And we've done some research with them on retrofit projects recently, which I think they're going to be publishing soon. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge, and there's still a long way to go. But I think the more that we can show and demonstrate that we can do this, that there are solutions, that we're all very clever people, and if you take the right approach, there are solutions. I think one of the things that I certainly find is that the approach that you take when you're looking at a building from a conservation angle is quite similar to the approach that you take when you're looking at it from a sustainability angle. And it's about understanding the building and what it needs and how it's performing and what the significance is. And that kind of, I think, so long as you take that approach and start from a position of knowledge, you can have a really well-informed proposal and strategy to take you forward.
It strikes me that, like, the need to take that very considered bespoke approach on every building means that scaling it up is really, really difficult. Like, could you see a situation, or do you know of any examples where, I'm imagining, there are blocks of conservation areas or areas that have, lots of listed buildings of the same typology, say it's a terrace street. Like, is it possible to say, okay, every one of these buildings needs this intervention, or does it have to be?
It's hard, because I think the answer is probably no, but mainly because even if you imagine a terrace street of, say, Georgian houses that all look externally like they're identical, you don't know until you visit each one what people have done over the last century to kind of knock it around, add stuff to it. They might have already tried to insulate the roof at some point, or done something, and everyone will be slightly different. So I think, unfortunately, there isn't necessarily a kind of a scalable method, but there is a scalable approach. And I think that's what we can bring, is that kind of approach where you start from a position of knowledge, you understand where the context, what you're working with, what the historic significance of the building is, and what the energy use is. Then you try to eliminate unnecessary waste of energy, and address those kind of defects, the cracks and gaps, and damp building fabric loses heat 30% quicker than dry fabric. So it's things like that. It's kind of identifying those issues that, there are some quick wins.
Okay.
But nobody really, like, it's not necessarily as exciting to talk about defects. And people want solar panels. You're like, well, can we address your damp? So looking at that, and then looking at kind of how you mitigate any energy use that you do need to use. So looking at really efficient lighting, for example. Some of these really old buildings still aren't using LED lighting. And it's things like that. You think, well, do you want solar panels just to power your really inefficient appliances? Is that? And then looking at how you improve the fabric, and then adding that kind of more active, solar panels or heat pumps or something like that. And it's that approach, and kind of trying to reduce energy demand before anything else.
I mean, that's such a good principle in any kind of retrofit, like that's, or thinking, or even building new buildings. I mean, if we tried to switch all of our energy use now to renewables, I don't know if we have enough.
Yeah, I don't think we do.
Fields and an area for wind turbines to do that, because we just waste so much electricity now because we import so much oil and gas from abroad. Whereas if we wanted to be energy independent, that means being much, more restrained with the energy we use, and not just,
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It doesn't matter if your building's listed or was built 20 years ago. The same principle should apply. My colleague came up with the analogy that if you've got a bucket of water that's got a leak in it, and you refuse to fix the leak but keep filling it, it doesn't matter how abundant the water source is or how clean the water source is, you're still wasting a lot of water. And it just doesn't make sense to do that with energy. Why would you?
Yeah. Do you see a break now with how we've... I mean, it sounds like there needs to be a change of paradigm in a sense with how we deal with historic heritage conservation in the move to net zero. So if we're on this race to net zero the next couple of years, like, does that mean treating building fabric differently, being less protective of these buildings?
I think we definitely need a bit of a shift. And I think it doesn't have to be that alarming. It doesn't have to be all of a sudden, let's, put double glazing everywhere, which, I know would cause some sharp intake of breath for a lot of my colleagues. But I think that it is about the approach. I think there's maybe been an avoidance of talking about these issues in listed buildings because it's hard, but actually we can't avoid it anymore. And it's not, we have the skills to do it. We've been working with listing historic buildings for as long as there's been buildings.
Yeah, exactly.
We know how to approach it, and we know how to do it, and we've done it with, like I said, the accessibility, and fire resistance and things like that, and that's stuff that we see is needed to happen often to keep the building in use and keep it safe. And if you start to think about the climate emergency as a health and safety issue and put it on the same par as fire safety, then we should be able to address it with the same urgency. And it doesn't. And I think if you follow the same principles as that constructive conservation that I was talking about, that kind of just manages change in a responsible way, and it starts from that kind of really clear understanding of what is significant and what you can and can't do. It's that, I think, is the way that we can do it without losing some of our fantastic heritage.
Is there... I mean, your sort of approach that you outlined there a minute ago, is that available anywhere for people, or is that something you're developing in-house?
We are in the process of developing it. I would like it to be available for everybody. But yes, it's definitely... I mean, it's not something that we've just invented. It's stuff that we've kind of collated information from various guidance documents and kind of thought people that are thinking about these things, and kind of just put it in a clearer hierarchy, if you like. And so, I think it's something that we should definitely try and share. We're sharing with clients that are interested in this, definitely. It makes sense for everybody to be doing it.
Because there's a really nice spirit of open source information within the sustainability community in the built environment, and I think there's so many tools and guides and everything. And I think what I'm seeing is that, like, nobody is really reinventing the wheel, but we're all pulling it together in different ways and packaging it up in different ways, and you can find a lot of resources that are very helpful.
Definitely, yeah. And I've certainly benefited from many open source resources, and I think that there is so much information out there. It's quite easy to get overwhelmed. And know where to look for certain things. And so actually part of the reason why we came up with this kind of approach and hierarchy was because we were like, but where do we go to look for these things? We kind of need just like a crib sheet that tells us what to do. And so we've been developing this for our internally so that our staff can all be sort of can work along the same approach. And so we've got a kind of standard way of dealing with things and talking about it. So yeah, I think it would be good to share more broadly.
It's so funny. It's the exact same thing I heard from when I spoke to Glenn Howell's architects. Mm-hmm. They said basically they developed their internal approach so that when people start working with them, they can say, here's our approach, read this document, and everyone's on the same page. Yeah. And they said they found that immensely helpful. And it sounds like it's a really good thing for a practice of any size to do, is to just get that stuff really clear and not be stuck inside, the sustainability head of sustainability's head or one of the director's heads. It needs to be out in the open.
And especially because we've got so many offices, we're kind of scattered all over, and it can't all be with one person. Yeah. We really need everybody to be singing the same song.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, let me have a quick look at my questions. Was there anything I missed?
I guess one of the things we haven't talked much about, which I'm very passionate about, is the benefits of reusing existing buildings, because that's obviously something that is very topical at the moment, particularly in the architectural press. And there's a couple of examples of unlisted buildings in London there's lots of controversy about their demolition. And so I think one of the things that I'm quite interested in is that, a lot of our work, we don't really have a choice. In a listed building, you can't demolish it. But it's that sort of attitude that I find really interesting, because why do we have that attitude for a certain set of buildings? Because we value the historical and heritage aspect of them, but we don't have that same value to apply to other buildings that aren't listed. It's a really interesting time to be talking about these things and working with existing buildings, because I think that the argument is pretty clear that, and we've done studies internally as well about embodied carbon and the comparison between a new build and a reusing existing structure, and the difference in embodied carbon just through not having a kind of a concrete frame, for example. And it's pretty definitive.
Wow. Okay.
So I kind of it's that how do we value materials and structures that exist in a way that goes beyond historical and heritage value? I find it really interesting. And
the ways of accounting for it are really can be very opaque for people who are not engineers or who are not versed in that. And I think one of the things that but perhaps what you were hinting at was the Marks and Spencer's building on Oxford Street in London, which has had a lot of controversy the last couple of months.
There's the ITV building now as well on South Bank.
Really?
Similar position, yeah.
And what was interesting was that whoever came forward with the proposal to demolish it originally had done the calculation and said, but over whatever period of time, the new building will be so sustainable that it will make up for whatever. And then someone else did an independent analysis and they said, no, that's not true. I have totally different numbers. And it's like, who do I believe? How do you?
Yeah, I think the message and it is a minefield. And I think, there's a lot of the industry is still learning about a lot of this. But I think the message is we need to stop using carbon now. It's all very well to say, we're designing a building that over its lifespan is going to use less carbon. We need to stop using carbon now. This is an emergency, and we need to start behaving like that. And I think that's the disconnect. And regardless of what numbers and who's right over the lifespan, actually, the argument for now is really compelling.
Yeah, that's a really, really good way of putting it. But that urgency sense is really important. One thing that might be a tricky question is when it comes to historic buildings, what is the thing that you think is going to be the most difficult to decarbonize? Either in the operation or the way you maintain it or the kind of processes?
That is a good question. I think the challenge is going to be that there are some buildings that just, we won't, because of their historic significance, we won't be able to do the fabric improvements that you might normally expect. And so I think all that will mean is that you have to accept that either there's a slightly different expectation of comfort, or you are running your air source heat pump or your ground source heat pump at a much higher level than you would be if you'd have been able to do those energy efficiency measures. And so there's going to be, I think there's going to be that tension of, okay, well, we did this so that we would save on our energy bills, but actually we're not saving anything because we're spending more on electricity. And that's going to be, I think that's going to be a challenge to try and overcome. So, because I think the risk is that people will go, my heat pump's not working, so I'm just going to go back to gas.
Yeah.
But it is working. It's just having to work harder because we can't improve the fabric in the way that would make it run at a lower at the most efficient way.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. But I guess it's like, yeah, I mean, what did we do? I mean, we had roaring fires, I guess, didn't we, before we had gas boilers?
And actually some of those lessons are really important. So it's like heating the person, not the space. It's that kind of, when we had, and old buildings had tapestries on the walls and, shutters, internal shutters and things like that. And that, there are things that will enhance the heritage of the existing building because they would have been things that would have been done in the past, which will still help improve those. But not to the same, like passive house standards that modern buildings will be, and it never will be in a lot of these buildings. But I think, and I think the other challenge definitely is that historic buildings behave completely differently to new buildings. They breathe, and so water vapor is allowed to kind of move through the structure in a way that it doesn't in a new build because you have different layers of impermeability, and that is a really key principle of historic buildings, and that kind of is how they can function. And the risk is that if you kind of a little overzealous with some of your energy efficiency measures and think, I just need to insulate everything, but you get the wrong kind of insulation that's not as breathable, that then the moisture collects in a way that you maybe didn't anticipate, and then you end up with other problems. And so that risk of a kind of a bad retrofit is also something that I think people need to be aware of.
Yes, there is a risk as well of a sort of a reputational thing of like if you see, it's almost like you can have 10 good examples, and once you see one bad example of a bad retrofit, then you say, we can't do this, we can't retrofit any buildings because look what happens. So getting it right, so important.
Exactly.
Mindful of the time, we've whizzed through.
It's flown by.
Fascinating conversation. But giving time for the final question, which is what I always ask people, which is that this idea that the 2020s are this critical decade in terms of taking action on climate change, and 2030 is a sort of I think at 2030 we'll be able to look back and think, have we done enough? Yeah, it really isn't. Much less than a decade away now. And I started asking this question in 2020, so time has passed. But from your perspective, and you can take this in any direction you like, what do you think needs to happen in the next 7 years or so?
Yeah. So I'm going to answer this from a very personal perspective.
Great.
Rather than we've talked about the reasons why we need to address the issues in historic buildings. So I'm going to take a different perspective, and this is my own view. I think we should allow ourselves to be more angry at the state of where we are. I think that's a completely justifiable response and emotion. I think it's important to acknowledge that and give ourselves time to feel that way, and particularly in the knowledge that we're not here by accident, we're here by quite a deliberate and coordinated approach by fossil fuel companies to kind of deflect and detract and distract us. And I think that it's important to feel like that, but it's important to not be distracted now. And it feels like we are facing multiple crises on all different fronts. But we've got to remember that they're all connected, that the energy crisis, rising fossil fuel costs, threat of nuclear war, pandemic, global pandemics, all of those things can be linked to our destructive relationship with nature and our quite toxic relationship with fossil fuels. And so it's important to just remember that we have a goal, we have a really clear goal. It's not complicated when you think about it like that. It's very, the implications and the different impacts of it are very complicated and wide-reaching, but they can all be traced back to one common thing. And I think it's also easy to get we were talking before we started recording about climate anxiety, and I think that that's also another emotion that is very valid and important to recognise. And I know you've talked about it on the podcast before. But I think that can also help you and individuals and kind of galvanise that positive action. And I think what we're learning is that we can't wait for politics and politicians, and that it's going to rely on individuals and communities and companies to really drive this change that we need. And I'm going to end on a really positive piece of advice, which we'll put a link in the show notes, is a TED talk by Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, who's a marine biologist in America. And it's a 10-minute TED talk, so it's like the quickest kind of intake of positive action. And it's called How to Find Joy in Climate Action. Oh, wow. Okay. And she puts it in the frame of a Venn diagram. And so if you imagine a Venn diagram of 3 circles, and she explains it much better than I can, but one circle you've got what are you good at? What skills do you have? Like what do you have to offer? And then the other second circle is what is the work that needs to be done? And then the final circle, which is the most important, is what brings you joy. And so she suggests that you've got to try and find something that keeps you in the centre of those 3 circles for as many minutes of your life. And that's how you find your superpower. And I just think it's such a really, really useful and practical piece of advice, and it can apply to anybody. It doesn't, whether you're involved in the built environment, not everybody feels empowered to be able to make a change in their workplace, but in their communities, in their families, there's other ways of doing it. And I think it's through that kind of collective action that we have hope.
I love that. Fantastic. I'm going to go watch that after this.
You should, yeah.
And if you're really lucky, there's another circle that overlaps that says what you can make a living from.
Yeah. Yes, I am that lucky.
Exactly. Yeah. So good. I had a sort of a seminar a couple of weeks ago about climate anxiety that I was a part of. And we started looking at some of the research about it, and we had these sort of breakout groups where we were talking to other people about it. And we started off the conversation being like, is climate anxiety like a psychological issue? Like, should people get diagnosed as having climate anxiety? And then we started moving through, and we were saying, actually, as you said, it's a perfectly valid response to what's happening around us. So it's not something that's wrong with the individual, it's something that's wrong with the world, and you're having a normal response to it. And then we got on to the next bit and we said, well, why aren't the people who aren't feeling climate anxiety, why aren't they? They're the weird ones.
Yeah,
they're the ones that something is wrong with them.
I completely agree. Yeah. It is, that gives me so much, like, I think about that so much. I'm just like, I don't understand how you don't see this as a problem. And yeah, it's a really good point.
Anyway, I'll put some links in the description.
Yes.
Where can people find out more about you or about Purcell?
So, yeah, we have a website, which we can put a link to.
Yeah.
And I'm on LinkedIn as well. And and I think that the one thing that I've certainly found in this kind of network of other people that care about sustainability is everybody's very giving with information. So we can include, I'm laura.barron@purcelluk.com. If you've got questions, if you've got anything really, please email me and let me try and help.
Brilliant.
Fantastic. Okay, let's wrap it up.